A rock with no water, no soil, and barely any space is somehow worth fighting over. Sounds ridiculous, right? But in the middle of Lake Victoria, that's exactly what's happening. Deep inside Africa's largest lake lies a harsh, lifeless chunk of rock known as Migingo Island. It's tiny, about half the size of a football field. No topsoil, no natural source of fresh water, and honestly, not even enough room to comfortably walk around without bumping into someone. Yet somehow, hundreds of people are packed onto it. Not visiting, living there. Stacked metal shacks cover almost every inch, turning the island into what looks like a floating scrapyard. It's crowded, chaotic, and brutally uncomfortable. Imagine living in a place where personal space basically doesn't exist, and even standing still feels crowded. So why would anyone choose this? Here's where things get strange. This insignificant-looking rock has triggered an ongoing military standoff between Kenya and Uganda. Two countries facing off over something that, at first glance, seems completely worthless. But that's only if you look at the surface. Because the real value isn't the island itself. It's what's hidden beneath the water around it. The deep waters surrounding this cramped, metallic slum are incredibly rich in fish, especially Nile perch, one of the most valuable freshwater fish in the world. We're not talking about small-scale fishing here. This is a billion-dollar industry. And suddenly, that useless rock starts to look very different. Think of it like this. The island is basically a front-row seat to one of the most profitable fishing zones in the entire lake. Whoever controls Migingo gains direct access to that wealth. So now the question isn't, why would anyone live there? It's, who gets to control it? And that's where things get tense. Both Kenya and Uganda claim ownership. Both have sent security forces, and both refuse to back down. What looks like a random cluster of metal huts is actually sitting at the center of a geopolitical argument with real money, real power, and real consequences behind it. And the people living there, they're caught right in the middle. So the next time you look at a map and see a tiny dot in the middle of a massive lake, don't assume it's meaningless. Because sometimes the smallest places hide the biggest conflicts. To really grasp how absurd Migingo Island is, you have to zoom way out. Because this story doesn't start with a rock, it starts with a giant. That giant is Lake Victoria. And calling it a lake almost feels misleading. This thing is massive, covering roughly 68,800 kilometers, or about 26,600 miles. It's the largest lake in Africa, the biggest tropical lake on Earth, and the second largest freshwater lake in the world. To put that into perspective, it's about the same size as the entire Republic of Ireland. Yeah, not exactly your average lake. It behaves more like an inland sea, with its own microclimates, sudden violent storms, and even scattered island chains, almost like mini archipelagos floating across its surface. But here's the twist. When you have something this big, things get complicated, especially politically, because Lake Victoria isn't owned by just one country. It's split between three. The southern portion, about 51%, belongs to Tanzania. The northwestern section, around 43%, falls under Uganda. And then there's Kenya, which, despite having a long stretch along the eastern shoreline, controls only about 6% of the lake. Just 6%. Already sounds uneven, right? But here's where things get messy. How do you even draw a fixed border on water that's constantly moving? That question goes back to the early 20th century. At the time, British colonial administrators were in charge of mapping out boundaries between the Kenya colony and the Uganda protectorate. And in 1926, they came up with a solution. Draw a straight line. Simple, clean, efficient. According to the 1926 Order in Council, the border would cut across the lake in a straight path, pointing towards specific landmarks on nearby islands and the mainland. On paper, it looked perfect. But in reality, nature doesn't care about straight lines. Water shifts, islands emerge, perspectives change. And those neat colonial borders, they start to blur a lot. And hidden right along that invisible, poorly defined boundary deep inside Kenya's tiny 6% slice of the lake sat something nobody really paid attention to at the time. A cluster of rocks, insignificant, ignored until it wasn't. That's where Migingo Island comes in. It sits just off the eastern edge of Lake Victoria, with the nearest mainland being Muhuru Bay in Kenya, about a 2-hour boat ride away, depending on how calm or brutal the lake decides to be that day. And from a distance, it doesn't even look like an island. It looks wrong. No smooth beaches, no greenery, no inviting shoreline. Just a sharp, jagged chunk of rock rising abruptly out of deep water like something that wasn't meant to be there. Geologically, that's pretty much what it is. A localized upthrust of rock, stripped completely bare after centuries of wind and water erosion. Before people showed up, it had absolutely nothing. No topsoil, no vegetation, no fresh water, not even enough flat space to comfortably set up a tent. And then there's the size. It covers roughly 2,000 square meters. That's half an acre. Picture a standard American football field. Now cut it exactly in half. That's it. That's the entire island. In fact, if you walked at a normal pace, you could cross from one end to the other in about 30 seconds. 30 seconds. It's tiny, isolated, completely resource-free. So naturally, the question becomes, why does anyone care? Why fight over this? Why live here? Well, the answer isn't on the rock itself. It's in the water around it. But before we get there, here's where things get even stranger. Because Migingo Island isn't alone. It's part of a microscopic cluster of 3 islands. Right nearby, you'll find Pyramid Island, a steep, almost impossible to climb rock formation that actually marks the official, undisputed border between Kenya and Uganda. But even more interesting, just 200 meters away, literally a stone's throw across the water, is another island called Migingo. And Migingo is the complete opposite of Migingo. It's bigger, flatter, covered with topsoil. It even has grass and trees growing naturally. In every possible way, it's the better island. If you were stranded out here and had to pick one place to survive, Migingo would be the obvious choice. No debate. And yet, no one lives there, completely empty, while hundreds of people choose to crowd onto a lifeless rock right next to it. So now the question changes again. Not just why Migingo, but what happened here? Why would people ignore a perfectly livable island and choose something almost uninhabitable instead? To answer that, we have to leave geography behind for a moment and step into something much stranger. History, rumors, and a story that's far darker than you'd expect from a half-acre rock in the middle of a lake. Here's the part that makes this whole situation even stranger. The story of Migingo Island doesn't begin centuries ago. No ancient empires. No legendary explorers. It starts in 1991 with just 2 fishermen, 2 Kenyan men, Dalmas Timbo and George Cabby, arrived in this remote corner of Lake Victoria looking for a place to set up a simple base, camp. And right next to them, a perfect island, flat land, vegetation, space to live. That island was Migingo, but they refused to step foot on it. Why? Because of fear. According to local legend, Migingo and even nearby Pyramid Island was believed to be cursed. Fishermen whispered stories about malevolent spirits haunting the greener islands. Some said demons roamed the shoreline. Others claimed people who tried to settle there would fall sick or simply disappear into the water. So imagine this choice. A green, a livable island, supposedly haunted, or a barren rock, completely empty. Timbo and Cab chose the rock, not because it was better, because it felt safer. And here's where it gets even more surreal. According to local stories, before claiming the island, they performed a ritual sacrifice, offering a rooster, goats, and wine to appease whatever forces might be watching. Only then did they settle on that half-acre slab of stone. And for years, it worked. A handful of Kenyan fishermen began using Migingo Island as a temporary, spirit-free base. No permanent structures, no real development, just survival. But here's the twist. That's only one version of the story. Because if you ask Kampala, they'll tell you something completely different. According to Uganda, the Kenyan story is just local folklore. Their version? In 2004, a Ugandan fisherman named Joseph Subuga arrived at the island and found it completely empty. No settlers, no fishermen, nothing. He set up camp, and soon other Ugandan fishermen joined him. From their perspective, they were the true founders. So now you've got two competing origin stories, two countries, two claims, both centered around a rock that for years nobody really cared about. And that's the key point. For a long time, neither Nairobi nor Kampala paid much attention to this place. Why would they? It was tiny, remote, worthless, just a rock. So what changed? How did a forgotten outcrop suddenly become important enough to drag entire nations into conflict? Well, the answer wasn't on the island, it was swimming beneath it. To understand that shift, you have to go back a few decades. In the 1950s and 60s, British colonial officials introduced a non-native species into Lake Victoria, the Nile perch. And this fish, it's not small. It can grow up to 2 meters long and weigh over 200 kilograms, basically an underwater monster. As an aggressive apex predator, the Nile perch devastated native fish populations. Entire ecosystems were thrown off balance. Ecologically, a disaster. But economically, something very different. By the early 2000s, global demand for Nile perch exploded. Markets in Europe and Asia couldn't get enough of its soft white meat. And suddenly, fishing wasn't just survival. It was business. Big business. Local fishermen even gave it a nickname, white gold. And here's where everything connects. The deep, cool waters surrounding Migingo Island turned out to be one of the richest Nile perch fishing zones in the entire 68,800 kilometers lake. Let that sink in. One of the best fishing spots in one of the largest lakes on Earth. So almost overnight, everything changed. Migingo wasn't useless anymore. It became a strategic gold mine, a perfect staging point. Control the island, and you control access to the fish. And once that secret got out, people started arriving. First dozens, then hundreds. But when money floods into a tiny, lawless place, something else follows. Crime. Pirates began targeting fishermen around the island. Armed groups would ambush boats, steal engines, take the fish, and sometimes leave fishermen stranded in open water. Imagine risking your life not just for fish, but from other people, desperate for protection. The fishermen turned to their governments. And in 2004, Uganda responded. They sent armed maritime police. They raised their flag. They established control. And to their credit, they stopped the piracy. But they didn't leave. Instead, Ugandan forces began taxing fishermen, especially Kenyans, charging fees for permits and asserting full administrative control over the island. Now imagine how that looked from Nairobi, Ugandan troops taxing Kenyan, and citizens on territory Kenya believed was theirs. That wasn't just a disagreement anymore. That was a problem. Kenya pointed back to the 1,926 colonial border maps. Uganda pointed right back, claiming the island fell within its own waters. And just like that, the tension exploded. What started as a story about demons turned into something far more real, a geopolitical standoff. Media outlets would later call it Africa's smallest war. Flags raised, forces deployed. Two nations facing off over half an acre of rock. But here's the most unexpected part of all. The fishermen didn't leave. They didn't run. They didn't abandon the island. They stayed. And instead of escaping the conflict, they built more houses, more structures, more layers of metal and wood, until every single inch of that rock was completely covered. Today, if you approach Migingo Island by boat, you won't see the rock. Not really. In fact, from a distance, it barely even looks like an island anymore. It looks like a giant metallic creature, almost like a rusted turtle floating in the middle of Lake Victoria. That jagged, barren stone the first settlers found, it's completely buried. Every single square inch of its 2,000 square meter surface is now covered. Corrugated iron sheets, scrap wood, improvised structures, stacked on top of each other, with almost no space in between. The rooftops overlap so tightly that they form a continuous layer of rusted metal, reflecting sunlight like a shimmering shield under the equatorial heat. Now here's where it gets almost unbelievable. Somewhere between 400 and 500 people live permanently on this half-acre of land. And some estimates, they push that number all the way up to 1,800. Think about that for a second. If you took that level of density and applied it to a single square mile, you'd be looking at well over 250,000 people packed into that space. It makes Manhattan look spacious. And because space basically doesn't exist here, there are no real streets, just narrow gaps, dark, tight corridors squeezed between metal walls. You walk single file. You duck under low roofs. You step over fishing gear just to move forward. It's chaotic, claustrophobic, but somehow alive. Because inside this maze, a fully functioning microcity has formed. You'll find 4 pubs, a pharmacy, a hair salon, food stalls, even several brothels, all hidden within these cramped passageways. It's loud, fast-paced, intense, almost like a frontier boomtown, just compressed into half a football field. But here's the harsh reality. This place has nothing. No plumbing, no natural fresh water, no real electricity. Grid, just a few noisy gas-powered generators struggling to keep things running. Every single necessity has to be brought in by boat, water, food, fuel, even basic items like toilet paper. And waste, there's no system, which means sanitation conditions are rough. The waters right next to the island are heavily polluted. So if residents want clean water, they literally have to boat farther out into the lake. So now we circle back to the question that still doesn't make sense. Why stay? Why would hundreds of people choose to live in a crowded, unsanitary metal settlement when a green, livable island Usingo is sitting just 200 meters away? And why stay when there's still political tension hanging over the island? Let's tackle that second question first, because surprisingly, the smallest war in Africa never fully exploded. Instead, it turned into something even stranger. Today, both Kenya and Uganda still claim Migingo Island. So what do? They share it, sort of. A fragile co-management agreement keeps the peace. And if you walk through those tight alleyways today, you'll see something surreal. Kenyan police and Ugandan police standing on the exact same half-acre of land, watching each other, each enforcing their own country's rules in the same space. It's like two systems operating in parallel without ever fully merging. Tense, awkward, unstable. But it works, at least for now. So again, why stay? Why endure all of this? The crowding, the sanitation, the risk, the tension. The answer hasn't changed. The fish. The waters around Migingo Island are still one of the richest Nile perch fishing zones in the entire lake. But here's the twist most people don't see. It's coming. The real money isn't just in the meat, it's inside the fish. In recent years, a massive market has exploded across Asia, especially in China and Hong Kong, for the Nile perch's swim bladder, also known as fish maw. Used in traditional medicine, luxury dishes, and even as a status symbol. This part of the fish is incredibly valuable. A single kilogram of high-quality dried swim bladder can sell for anywhere between $200 and over $1,000. Let that sink in. One part of one fish worth that much. So for fishermen living on Migingo Island, everything changes. On the mainland, economic opportunities are limited. Poverty is a real and constant pressure. But out here, a skilled fisherman can earn in 1 week what might take months back on land. And suddenly, this place doesn't feel like a slum. It feels like an opportunity, a risky one, a chaotic one, but still a chance. So they stay. They tolerate the cramped space, the lack of infrastructure, the lingering tension between two countries, because the water offers something rare, a way out. In the end, Migingo Island isn't just a strange geographic anomaly. It's a story about survival, about how colonial borders can echo decades later, and about how far people are willing to go when there's white gold swimming just beneath the surface. And honestly, it raises a bigger question. How many other places in the world look insignificant on a map, but hide stories just as intense? Because next time, we're heading to Mima Mounds, a landscape that looks like the earth itself has goosebumps. And here's the strange part. No one really knows why they exist. If this made you look at the world a little differently, you might want to stick around, because the map still has a lot of secrets left.